Obama was speaking for her in Pennsylvania, and she was in a tan suit in Vegas. What did you make of her Univision town hall?
You're going to make me analyze the tan suit analogies now, Stephanie? I sure hope not. Listen, her being here to do this Univision town hall in Las Vegas, as you well know, was very, very important. The Hispanic vote is critical in Nevada. Nevada is one of the 7 or 8 states that are going to make the difference. It could be as much as 20% of the electorate. And so her willingness to try to connect with folks as she did tonight. That's what struck me the most, by the way, Stephanie, is the empathy that she showed for people who were really struggling and hurting. And I tried to imagine Trump being on stage and emoting anything but bile and vitriol. The contrast is there. People can call it a vibe election. People can call it whatever they want. But she came across tonight in that town hall, even though she didn't answer some questions, as a real human being. And by the way, Stephanie, in this race, that's the bar. The bar is about as low as it can be set by her opponent.
But are people in Nevada paying attention to that town hall? Besides the people in the room who could see her and feel her, how much traction will tonight's event get for her in the state?
It's a good question. I mean, we covered it. We have a story up, played very prominently about the town hall. But let me tell you what was more significant today than that town hall in Las Vegas. You had Catherine Cortez Masto, the first Latina ever elected to the U.S. Senate, doing a rally with the Culinary Union, which is majority Hispanic, and going out and canvassing for Kamala Harris. Now, listen, Stephanie, I know it's the oldest cliche in the book, but this state is within 1 point or so, both campaigns think. Turnout is going to be everything. And the fact that you have the first Latina energizing a majority Hispanic union that has changed elections here, I think that's an even more significant event.
That's not cliche. That's the whole ball game. Mike, she also rallied today in Phoenix. Watch this clip.
Y'all might have seen that just last night, Donald Trump officially ruled out any more debates. Disservice to the voters. I also think it's a pretty weak move.
Mike, what do you think about what you heard from her today?
I like her style. And again, as somebody that's a Californian who's been watching her since, she was a DA in San Francisco, to watch her rise up to meet her moment is really pretty spectacular. I think the likability factor is not something that we've talked about in campaigns for some time, because we haven't had a candidate entering the final 3 weeks of a campaign with net positives in a long time. So I think this is going to be a big part of the voters' calculation, especially with the contrast, as you mentioned in the intro, with Donald Trump, a historically negatively polarizing figure. Even with these very small handful of undecideds that are there, you can't discount the fact that she's just a likable person doing these long-form interviews on podcasts, very comfortable in town hall environments. There is something to that, and I think it plays into what John was just mentioning about vibes and the energy that's out there. I think it's something that we're not quantifying in some of the polling data right now.
Jeff, you were in Pennsylvania today at the rally where former President Obama spoke. How effective do you think he can be as a surrogate in this final stretch? And we should point out, even if he's not super effective, he's out there. When you think about the last Republicans who were in the White House stumping for Donald Trump, well, that's George Bush and Dick Cheney. George Bush is dead silent, expecting to endorse no one. And of course, Dick Cheney, he's voting for Kamala Harris.
He certainly is. And you're absolutely right, Steph. He is out there, and every little bit of energy that a former president can come up with, or any surrogate for that matter in this state, in Pennsylvania, where I am today, could help move the needle. And that's how close the election is. And we all know that Pennsylvania could be the linchpin for deciding who ends up in the White House. So President Obama's remarks tonight were pretty vintage Obama. He absolutely lambasted Donald Trump on from everything from selling Bibles to generally his values. He got kind of personal, talking about his mom and the values that he was raised with, and then referencing former President Trump's just disinformation in the last few days or last week about the hurricanes. He said, when did that become okay? And that got a reaction from the crowd, and it's kind of showed a little bit of emotion on Obama's side, that it's troubling to him to watch the person who succeeded him, who could potentially succeed Joe Biden, representing values that he just does not agree with and that he does not consider American. To bring it all together, though, the question is, does it matter? The voters who support President Trump don't see it that way. And even if they did, they don't factor it in as something that's important. What President Obama is trying to say, or is trying to encourage, is to grab those voters here in Pennsylvania and in the other swing states that he'll be going to in the coming weeks to draw that contrast and say, look, this is a reason not to vote for that guy. And he uses his style and his oratorical skills to bring that across. The question is, will it push people to the polls, or will they stay home?
Vintage Obama, if you close your eyes, it sounds like current Josh Shapiro. Jeff, the other person on the stage with him is Bob Casey. Is President Obama stumping for VP Harris? How much, if at all, how much is this helping Bob Casey's race, which is a very difficult one?
Well, Bob Casey stayed on the stage the whole time, which I thought was probably very deliberate. The fact that he was there, A, that he introduced President Obama, B, that he stayed on there throughout his remarks. He'll be in all the pictures, all the shots, all the video. That's deliberate. And President Obama really wants to help Bob Casey. His aides have said that he's focused, of course, on the White House race, but also on down ballot races, on preserving the Democratic majority in the Senate, and maybe bringing the House back to Democratic control as well. So I think, to your question, will it help? I think every little bit can help right now, just like it can with Harris in such a closely divided state like Pennsylvania. Will it be enough? TBD.
Mike, what do you think about Obama in the final stretch? Will this push help her? Many people in the Harris-Walz campaign would like to see a link between what Obama did in 2008 and what they're trying to do right now.
Look, I think that's exactly right. And look, this isn't a coincidence that none of this isn't done without a lot of thought and research behind it. If he wasn't polling popularly with the base, he wouldn't be there. He's there because he's trying to bring back some of that energy and remind people of what things could be again, especially after such a really dark, troubling history in the past. Even during the Biden administration, the specter of Donald Trump has just always been there since he came down on the scene in the escalator in Trump Tower. It's just been a pall over the American people. I think there is something hopeful. There is something that reminds people that America can be better, that can aspire to be better, and there's nobody better to do that than Barack Obama. I know some of his side comments, that we saw some of those clips going around on social media where he was having some side conversations with younger black men, speaking to them directly and saying, look, this is about something bigger than you and I. This is a bigger movement, something that's right for the country, and it's our time to step up. Is him trying to find that again, reaching down, finding that inside Americans, pulling the best out of them, and inspiring them positively to go to the polls.
John, Donald Trump is spending some of these last crucial days in very blue states, Illinois, California, and New York, while VP Harris is focused on the battlegrounds. What do you think of the strategies here? Is Trump going to these blue states basically because it's where he likes to be more, personally?
Well, I think he likes to be anywhere where he has an adoring crowd and he's not thinking about the electoral calculus that much. But I will say, Stephanie, he is going to be in a very purple state in a couple days. In fact, he'll be here tomorrow doing I think it's $1 million to get in to be with Miriam Adelson and Donald Trump. And then the next day, what is he doing, Stephanie? In Southern Nevada, he's doing a Hispanic roundtable 2 days after the Kamala Harris has done this town hall. They have seen the same polls that everyone else has here in Nevada, where there has been slippage among the Hispanic vote that has been critical to Joe Biden's win here, to Hillary Clinton's win here, and yes, to Barack Obama's win here. So, yeah, Trump is going to blue states, which may seem pointless or just egomaniacal, but he's also being sent here because this state could be important, and it's very, very close.
Well, Michigan is important, and he's voiced what he thinks of Detroit. I want to play something that he said today about what will happen if Harris wins. And I want to remind the audience while they're listening to this, he made these comments while he was in Detroit at the Detroit Economic Club. Watch this.
The whole country is going to be like, you want to know the truth? It'll be like Detroit. Our whole country will end up being like Detroit if she's your president. You're going to have a mess on your hands.
Jeff, did I hear that right? His political tactic is to trash talk the city that he is speaking in, a city in a crucial swing state.
Yeah, and he's done that before. I mean, it sounds familiar to me. Didn't he say something similar about the city in which the Republican Party held its
Minneapolis
national convention this year?
Yes,
so
he did.
There you go. I mean, he says things like that. I don't know if he realizes what he's saying when he's saying it. You have to assume that he does. It certainly reveals the antipathy he feels about Detroit when he says that out loud. But it doesn't seem like it would make for good politics, particularly in a state that is a swing state and that he really needs. But by the way, I think the polling right now shows that he's doing better in Michigan than Vice President Harris is. So, you know, he showed up, he made his remarks. I also think we as reporters and viewers and just political watchers of this can't underestimate the fact that sometimes when he says things like this, his supporters just don't care. It just doesn't bother them. And it seems like political malpractice to those of us who cover politics and watch politics closely, but it just doesn't resonate in the way that it might have with a different type of candidate.